March 14, 1943. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The German Panzer IV tank turret sat motionless on the test stand, its 4 inches of homogeneous steel plate facing the firing line 100 yards distant. Metallurgical engineers from the Army Ordnance Department had spent 3 weeks preparing this captured specimen for a test that would challenge everything American armor designers believed about protection. The M375mm anti-tank gun, America's standard tank destroyer weapon, was loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. The round had been specifically designed to defeat German armor at combat ranges. Every calculation, every metallurgical analysis, every penetration formula predicted this shot would punch completely through the Panzer's turret face. The sharp crack echoed across the proving ground. Observers through high-powered optics watched the tracer streak toward the target. Impact. The armor-piercing round struck the Panzer turret dead center and shattered into fragments that tumbled harmlessly down the front of the steel plate. The German armor held. No penetration, not even a crack. Standing among the observers was a 41-year-old metallurgist named Dr. Thomas Waterhouse, who had spent the previous 18 months being told his revolutionary armor design was too expensive, too complex, and unnecessary. The German plate that had just defeated America's best anti-tank round used principles Waterhouse had proposed in 1941 and been rejected. The mathematics of armored warfare were being written not in thickness measurements, but in molecular structures that determined how steel responded to high-velocity impact. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The transformation had begun 3 years earlier in a converted warehouse in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Carnegie Steel Corporation maintained a small research laboratory devoted to specialty steel applications. Dr. Thomas Waterhouse had joined Carnegie in 1936 after completing his doctorate in metallurgical engineering at MIT. His dissertation had focused on the crystalline structure of steel under extreme stress, work that seemed purely academic until war clouds gathered over Europe. By early 1940, as German panzers demonstrated devastating effectiveness in Poland and France, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department began desperately seeking improved armor protection. The American approach to tank armor had remained essentially unchanged since World War I. Homogeneous steel plates rolled to uniform thickness, heat-treated for hardness, and bolted or welded onto vehicle frames. The thicker the plate, the better the protection. Simple, predictable, inadequate. Waterhouse had been studying captured intelligence reports on German armor composition throughout 1940. What he discovered disturbed him profoundly. German metallurgists had achieved something American steelmakers dismissed as impossible. They had created armor plate that provided protection equivalent to steel 50% thicker through a process called face hardening. The principle was theoretically simple but practically complex. Rather than making the entire armor plate uniformly hard, German manufacturers created a dual-layer structure. The outer face of the plate, the side facing enemy fire, was heat-treated to extreme hardness, approaching that of tool steel. This surface layer, typically 20 to 30% of the plate's total thickness, would shatter incoming armor-piercing projectiles on impact. Behind this ultra-hard face layer, the steel transitioned gradually to a much tougher, more ductile backing material. This softer steel absorbed the energy of the shattered projectile fragments and prevented the armor plate itself from cracking under impact stress. The result was armor that could defeat projectiles that would easily penetrate homogeneous plates of the same thickness. In October 1940, Waterhouse submitted a detailed proposal to the Army Ordnance Department. He outlined a process for manufacturing face-hardened armor using techniques adapted from German methods but modified for American steel production capabilities. The proposal included extensive metallurgical data, impact resistance calculations, and cost estimates. It sat on Colonel James Henderson's desk at Aberdeen Proving Ground for 6 weeks before receiving a response. The rejection letter, dated November 23, 1940, contained technical objections and budgetary concerns that would echo through the next 2 years of American armor development. Henderson's response, preserved in National Archives records, revealed the institutional resistance Waterhouse would face. Your proposal for dual-hardness armor plate represents interesting theoretical work, but practical implementation faces insurmountable obstacles. American steel mills lack the specialized heat-treating equipment required. The process you describe would reduce production rates by 40% compared to current homogeneous armor manufacturing. Cost per ton would increase by 65%. Most critically, testing would require minimum 12 months before any production could begin. The Army requires immediate expansion of existing armor plate production using proven methods. Your proposal is rejected. Waterhouse understood the objections were not merely bureaucratic obstruction. They reflected genuine constraints. American steel industry in 1940 was only beginning to expand for war production. Carnegie Steel and Bethlehem Steel, the two largest armor plate suppliers, were struggling to meet existing contracts using conventional methods. Introducing a completely new manufacturing process, requiring specialized equipment and extended testing, seemed impossible given the urgency of rearmament. But Waterhouse also understood something Colonel Henderson did not. The armor thickness race was unwinnable. German tanks were already carrying 80mm frontal armor on Tiger prototypes. Intelligence reports suggested even heavier armor in development. If American tanks tried to match German protection using homogeneous steel, the weight would become prohibitive. A Sherman tank with 4 inches of homogeneous frontal armor would weigh over 40 tons, exceeding the capacity of most bridges and making the vehicle impossibly slow. Face-hardened armor offered the only solution. 3 inches of properly hardened plate could defeat what 5 inches of homogeneous steel could not. The weight savings would allow American tanks to maintain mobility while achieving protection levels that matched or exceeded German designs. Waterhouse became convinced that rejection of his proposal would cost American lives measured in thousands once tanks met in combat. Through the spring of 1941, Waterhouse continued his research privately. Carnegie Steel's management, more receptive than Army bureaucrats, allowed him to use company resources for experimental work. The challenge was developing a face-hardening process that could be performed with equipment American steel mills already possessed or could acquire quickly. German face-hardening relied on carburization, a process where carbon was diffused into the steel surface at high temperature. The carbon enrichment created the ultra-hard face layer, but carburization required specialized furnaces and took days to complete. Waterhouse needed something faster that used standard heat-treating equipment. His breakthrough came in May 1941 while examining failed armor plate samples. Carnegie had supplied homogeneous armor for the M3 medium tank program. Several plates had cracked during ballistic testing. Waterhouse analyzed the fracture patterns and realized something unexpected. The cracks always initiated at the impact point where the projectile struck, but they propagated through the backing material where the steel was softer. If the backing material had been even tougher, more resistant to crack propagation, the plate might have survived despite the impact damage. That observation led Waterhouse to a different approach than German carburization. Instead of adding carbon to harden the face, he would modify the heat-treating process to create a hardness gradient through careful control of heating and cooling rates. The face would be heated to higher temperature and cooled more rapidly, creating the hard surface layer. The backing would be heated less and cooled more slowly, preserving toughness. The process required no specialized equipment, just precise control of furnace temperatures and quenching procedures. It could be performed using the same infrastructure that produced homogeneous armor. Production rates would decrease only slightly. Costs would increase maybe 15%, not 65%. By June 1941, Waterhouse had produced his first experimental plates using the gradient heat-treating process. Initial testing at Carnegie's facility showed promising results. Projectiles that penetrated homogeneous armor failed to penetrate the face-hardened samples of the same thickness. He submitted a revised proposal to Aberdeen Proving Ground in July 1941. This version included sample plates, test data, and detailed manufacturing procedures. It addressed every objection from the previous rejection. Colonel Henderson reviewed the materials with his engineering staff. Their response came in August 1941 and represented partial progress mixed with continued resistance. Your revised proposal demonstrates improved practicality compared to the previous submission. However, implementation still requires extensive testing that cannot be completed before mid-1942 at earliest. The Army's immediate priority is expanding production of M3 medium tanks using current armor specifications. Any armor design changes must wait until that expansion is complete. Your proposal is deferred pending availability of testing resources. Deferred was better than rejected, but barely. The M3 medium tank program was consuming all available armor plate production. The Army had no capacity to test alternatives until existing contracts were fulfilled. Waterhouse understood the institutional logic, but found it frustrating beyond measure. The testing he needed would take perhaps 6 weeks if given priority. Instead, it would wait months or years while tanks went into production using inferior armor. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 changed everything and nothing simultaneously. America's entry into the war created desperate urgency for tank production, but that urgency reinforced conservative decisions. The Army wanted proven designs manufactured as quickly as possible. Experimental armor development seemed like dangerous distraction from immediate needs. Through the spring of 1942, American tank production accelerated dramatically. The M3 medium tank, Grant to the British, Lee to American forces, entered mass production. The design was already obsolescent before production began. A tall, ungainly vehicle with a 37mm gun in a small turret and a 75mm gun in a side sponson. But it was available when nothing else was, and American factories could build it in quantity. The M3's armor protection was marginal. Frontal hull armor was 51mm, about 2 inches, of homogeneous steel. Turret armor was 38mm. German 50mm anti-tank guns could penetrate the M3's frontal armor at combat ranges. When M3 tanks first encountered German panzers in North Africa in mid-1942, the results confirmed every fear about inadequate protection. The Battle of Gazala in May and June 1942 saw British Grant tanks, identical to American M3s, face German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. The British tanks were systematically destroyed. German 75mm guns punched through Grant armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. British 75mm guns, carried in the Grant's sponson mount, struggled to penetrate German frontal armor even at close range. Lieutenant Colonel William Daly, an American observer attached to British 8th Army headquarters, filed a report on July 2, 1942 that reached Aberdeen Proving Ground and triggered urgent re-evaluation of American armor design. Daly's assessment, marked confidential at the time but declassified in the 1970s, contained brutal honesty. American M3 tanks provided to British forces have proven decisively inferior to German armor in protection and firepower. German tanks survive multiple hits while remaining combat effective. British crews report that 75mm armor-piercing rounds bounce off German panzer turrets at ranges where German guns penetrate Grant armor effortlessly. The psychological effect on tank crews is devastating. Men are reluctant to engage German tanks knowing their own armor provides insufficient protection. The M3 tank is obsolete. Any replacement must prioritize survivability equally with firepower and mobility. Current armor protection standards are inadequate. Daly's report arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground on July 8, 1942. Within days, the Ordnance Department initiated crash programs to improve both the M3's successor design and armor protection standards. The M4 medium tank, already in development since early 1941, became the focus of intense scrutiny. Its design featured better armor layout than the M3, with frontal hull armor increased to 76 mm and a fully rotating turret mounting the 75 mm gun. But even 76 mm of homogeneous armor was insufficient against German guns. Intelligence reports indicated new German tank destroyers mounting 88 mm guns were entering service. Those weapons could defeat 100 mm of homogeneous armor at 1,000 yards. To provide adequate protection using homogeneous steel, the M4 would need frontal armor exceeding 120 mm, approximately 5 inches. At that thickness, the tank would weigh over 45 tons, making it too heavy for American tactical bridges and landing craft. Someone at Aberdeen remembered Waterhouse's deferred proposal. On July 15, 1942, Colonel Henderson's office contacted Carnegie Steel, requesting Waterhouse present his face-hardened armor research to an emergency review board. The meeting occurred on July 22 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Waterhouse brought sample plates and test data. He explained the gradient heat treating process and demonstrated its production feasibility. The review board, comprising 5 Army Ordnance officers and 3 civilian metallurgical engineers, examined Waterhouse's samples with deep skepticism mixed with desperate hope. They understood American tanks were dying in North Africa because their armor was inadequate. They also understood that any change to armor specifications would disrupt production schedules already stretched beyond capacity. Major Daniel Foster, the board's senior metallurgist, focused on practical implementation questions. His interrogation of Waterhouse revealed both the proposal's strengths and the institutional challenges it faced. Foster's questions, recorded in meeting minutes, covered territory that would determine the project's fate. Dr. Waterhouse, your test data shows impressive results on small samples. Can this process scale to full-size armor plates measuring 6 feet by 12 feet? Can American steel mills perform this heat treatment reliably? What quality control measures ensure consistent hardness gradients? How many plates will fail quality testing? What happens to failed plates? Can they be salvaged or must they be scrapped? Most importantly, how long before production deliveries could begin? Waterhouse answered methodically, addressing each concern with data and projections based on his experimental work. Full-size plates required larger furnaces, but no fundamentally different equipment. American mills could perform the heat treatment using existing infrastructure with minor modifications. Quality control required hardness testing at multiple depths, but was straightforward. Failure rates should be below 5% based on his trials. Failed plates could be reheated and retreated, minimizing scrap losses. Then came the critical timeline question. Waterhouse estimated that Carnegie Steel could begin production deliveries within 12 weeks if given immediate authorization. Bethlehem Steel would need perhaps 16 weeks. Both mills would require priority access to furnace modifications and quality control equipment, but nothing in the process demanded long lead time materials or exotic resources. The board deliberated for 3 hours after Waterhouse's presentation concluded. Their decision, announced on July 23rd, represented a calculated gamble on unproven technology driven by combat necessity. Aberdeen would authorize Carnegie Steel to produce 100 face-hardened armor plates for the M4 tank program. 50 plates would be installed on pilot vehicles for comprehensive testing. 50 would undergo ballistic testing to establish penetration resistance data. If testing validated Waterhouse's claims, full-scale production would begin immediately. If testing revealed problems, the Army would at least have definitive data explaining why face-hardened armor was impractical. Either outcome justified the investment given the urgent need for improved protection. Waterhouse returned to Pittsburgh on July 24, 1942, with formal authorization to proceed. Carnegie Steel's management committed company resources to the project with enthusiasm bordering on desperation. The steel industry understood that tank contracts represented enormous business opportunity, but only if American tanks could survive combat. Better armor meant more contracts. The next 12 weeks tested every aspect of Waterhouse's process and his own endurance. Scaling from laboratory samples to full-size armor plates revealed complications that small-scale testing had not predicted. The massive furnaces required to heat 12-foot plates to treatment temperature took hours to reach uniform temperature throughout their volume. Temperature gradients within the furnace created hardness variations across the plate surface unless carefully controlled. Quenching massive plates without causing warping or cracking required specialized fixtures and precisely controlled water flows. The toughest challenge was quality control. Each plate required hardness testing at 9 locations across its surface and at 3 depths through its thickness, 27 measurements per plate. Testing was destructive, requiring core samples drilled from the edges. The measurements had to prove the plate achieved target hardness on the face while maintaining required toughness in the backing. By early October 1942, Carnegie delivered the first batch of face-hardened plates to Aberdeen. 48 plates met specifications. 2 had failed quality testing and been successfully retreated. The initial ballistic testing began October 9th. The test protocol was straightforward and brutal. Face-hardened plates would be subjected to the same ballistic tests that established penetration data for homogeneous armor. German 75mm armor-piercing rounds captured in North Africa would be fired at the plates from various TPI-SA, ranges and angles. American 75mm anti-tank rounds would be fired to establish comparative data. The test that opened this narrative occurred on October 15th, when German ammunition struck 3-inch face-hardened plate from 100 yards. The round shattered on impact. The plate showed deep cratering but no penetration. Homogeneous plate of the same thickness was penetrated completely at that range. Testing continued through October and November 1942. By early December, Aberdeen had compiled comprehensive data, proving face-hardened armor provided protection equivalent to homogeneous plates 50 to 60% thicker. 3 inches of Waterhouse's face-hardened plate defeated what 5 inches of conventional armor could not. The weight savings were enormous. An M4 tank with face-hardened frontal armor could achieve protection exceeding 4 inches of equivalent homogeneous thickness while weighing several tons less. The formal authorization for full-scale production came on December 18, 1942. The Army Ordnance Department issued contracts to both Carnegie Steel and Bethlehem Steel for face-hardened armor plates using Waterhouse's gradient heat treating process. The specification, designated Armor, Homogeneous, Face-Hardened, Class A, became the new standard for American medium tank production, beginning with M4 Sherman tanks manufactured after March 1943. The transition from homogeneous to face-hardened armor occurred with remarkable speed considering the scale of American tank production. By early 1943, the United States was manufacturing approximately 2,000 Sherman tanks monthly across multiple assembly facilities. Each tank required armor plates ranging from small access hatches to massive glacis plates weighing over 1 ton. Changing the metallurgical specifications for every plate without disrupting production schedules represented a logistical challenge, as significant as the original technical development. Carnegie Steel's solution was elegant. Rather than shutting down production lines to retool, they modified their heat-treating procedures incrementally. Furnaces were recalibrated during normal maintenance periods. Quality control inspectors were trained on the new hardness testing protocols in 2-week courses. Production workers learned the modified quenching procedures through hands-on training that emphasized the critical cooling rate differences between face-hardened and homogeneous plates. By March 1943, Carnegie was producing face-hardened plates at 95% of their previous homogeneous armor output rates. Bethlehem Steel achieved similar production rates by April. The predicted 40% production decrease that had been cited in the original rejection never materialized. Waterhouse's gradient heat treating process proved nearly as fast as conventional methods while producing dramatically superior armor. The first M4 Sherman tanks equipped with face-hardened armor rolled off assembly lines in March 1943. These vehicles were externally identical to earlier Shermans built with homogeneous armor. No visual differences existed. but the metallurgical transformation made them fundamentally different machines. Where earlier Shermans carried 76 mm of frontal hull armor, providing marginal protection, the new vehicles carried 76 mm of face-hardened plate, providing protection equivalent to approximately 120 mm of homogeneous steel. The improved Shermans were initially deployed to units training for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily scheduled for July 1943. Tank crews received no special notification that their vehicles featured revolutionary armor. The Army wanted to avoid creating expectations that might not be fulfilled in combat. Better to let the armor prove itself through performance than through promises. Lieutenant Robert Hayes of the 1st Armored Division received his new Sherman in April 1943 at Fort Benning, Georgia. His crew spent 6 weeks training for amphibious operations before shipping to North Africa in May. Hayes and his crew, like thousands of other American tankers, had no idea their tank's armor represented a technological leap beyond earlier models. They would discover the difference under fire. The invasion of Sicily began on July 10, 1943. American and British forces landed on the island's southern coast, pushing inland against determined German and Italian resistance. The 1st Armored Division, equipped with the new face-hardened armor Shermans, encountered German panzer units near Gela on July 11th. The engagement would provide the first combat test of Waterhouse's armor under conditions that made controlled testing impossible. Hayes's platoon, 5 Sherman tanks, encountered 4 German Panzer IVs defending a ridgeline overlooking the coastal plain. The German tanks opened fire at approximately 800 yards. Hayes watched the first German round streak toward his tank with the terrible certainty that characterized every tanker's worst moment. The 75 mm armor-piercing round struck his Sherman's frontal hull at a slight angle. Hayes braced for penetration, fire, and death. Nothing happened. The round had shattered on impact. His tank was undamaged. His crew was alive. The German tanks fired repeatedly as Hayes's platoon advanced and returned fire. Multiple rounds struck Hayes's Sherman. Each impact produced a jarring crash and shower of sparks as the projectile disintegrated against the face-hardened armor. None penetrated. Hayes's gunner destroyed 2 Panzer IVs. The remaining German tanks withdrew after their ammunition failed to achieve any penetrations despite multiple hits. When Hayes's crew examined their Sherman after the engagement, they counted 7 impact points on the frontal hull and turret. The armor showed deep cratering at each impact site. Some craters exceeded 2 inches deep, but none had penetrated. The backing material had absorbed the impact energy without cracking. The tank remained fully operational, despite damage that would have destroyed earlier Shermans with homogeneous armor. Similar encounters occurred across Sicily through July and August 1943. American tank crews discovered that their new Shermans could survive hits that had been death sentences in earlier models. German tank commanders found their previously reliable 75 mm guns failing to penetrate American armor at ranges where they had routinely destroyed British and earlier American tanks. Mitchell's assessment captured the reality that face-hardened armor, while revolutionary, was not invulnerable. The German 88 mm gun, whether mounted on Tiger tanks or towed anti-tank carriages, could defeat even the best American armor at close ranges. But the same weapon had routinely penetrated earlier homogeneous armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. The face-hardened armor reduced the danger zone by approximately 40%, giving American crews more room to maneuver and more time to identify threats. By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, American tank production had achieved remarkable scale and sophistication. The United States was manufacturing approximately 3,000 armored vehicles monthly, including Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, and light tanks. Virtually all combat vehicles featured face-hardened armor. The industrial capacity that had seemed inadequate in 1941 had been transformed through systematic expansion and technical innovation. Waterhouse had become a consultant to multiple steel manufacturers and the Army Ordnance Department. His gradient, heat-treating process had been refined through practical experience into a highly reliable production method. By mid-1944, face-hardened armor plate quality was so consistent that rejection rates had fallen below 2%. The process that Army bureaucrats had dismissed as too complex and unreliable in 1941 had become standard procedure, producing better results than conventional methods. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, brought American armor with face-hardened protection against German panzers under conditions that would determine the campaign's outcome. The hedgerow country of Normandy provided perfect defensive terrain for German forces. Tank engagements occurred at close ranges, where German weapons achieved maximum effectiveness. The brutal fighting through June and July 1944 tested every aspect of American armor design. The Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, provided a sobering reminder that even excellent armor could not overcome tactical mistakes. British forces, including Sherman tanks equipped with face-hardened armor, were ambushed by a company of German Tiger tanks commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann. The Tigers, mounting 88mm guns and carrying frontal armor up to 150mm thick, destroyed or disabled 25 British tanks and other vehicles in approximately 15 minutes. But examination of the destroyed Shermans after the battle revealed important details. Several had been struck from the side or rear, where armor was thinner and less well protected. Others had suffered hits at ranges below 300 yards, where even 88mm guns could defeat face-hardened frontal armor. Critically, 2 Shermans had survived multiple frontal hits at moderate ranges before being destroyed by side shots. The face-hardened armor had performed as designed, protecting crews from frontal fire while remaining vulnerable to flanking attacks. The lesson for American tank commanders was clear. Face-hardened armor provided excellent protection from frontal attack at medium ranges, but did not eliminate the need for tactical skill, situational awareness, and proper employment of terrain. The armor was a tool that enabled aggressive tactics, not a guarantee of invulnerability. Through the summer and fall of 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and pursued German forces across France, American tank crews developed sophisticated understanding of their vehicles' capabilities and limitations. They learned to angle their hulls to maximize armor effectiveness. They learned the precise ranges at which different German weapons could penetrate their protection. They learned to identify Tiger and Panther tanks by silhouette and to immediately maneuver for flank shots rather than attempting frontal engagement. The armor gave them time to employ those tactics. Where earlier Shermans had been vulnerable to immediate destruction from any hit, the new face-hardened armor allowed crews to survive the first shot, recognize the threat, and respond appropriately. That survival margin, measured in seconds, meant the difference between destroyed tanks and successful engagements. By December 1944, when German forces launched their last major offensive in the Ardennes, American tank forces had achieved a level of operational effectiveness that would have seemed impossible in 1942. The Battle of the Bulge saw American armor, including many units equipped with face-hardened armor Shermans, fight German panzers to a standstill, despite initial surprise and numerical disadvantage. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, led the relief column that broke through to besieged American forces in Bastogne on December 26, 1944. His force of 54 Sherman tanks fought through German defensive positions that included Panzer IVs, Panthers, and at least 2 Tiger tanks. The battalion suffered casualties but accomplished its mission. Abrams's tanks absorbed dozens of hits from German anti-tank weapons. The face-hardened armor prevented many hits from penetrating that would have destroyed earlier Shermans. Abrams reflected on armor protection in a post-war interview conducted in 1953. His assessment provided a combat commander's perspective on the technical innovation that had saved countless American lives. The Sherman was never as good as German heavy tanks in armor thickness or gun power, but our Shermans from 1943 onward had armor that was tougher than it looked. I saw tanks take 3, 4, 5 hits and keep fighting. The crews stayed alive, The tank kept moving. That's what mattered. We couldn't build Tigers. Our industrial base wasn't set up for it, and we couldn't ship 45-ton tanks across the Atlantic efficiently. But we could build Shermans with armor that was good enough to give our crews a fighting chance. The metallurgists who figured out how to make thin armor defeat thick penetrators saved more American lives than most generals did. They just never got medals for it. The final statistics of armor performance in World War II validated everything Waterhouse had predicted in his rejected 1941 proposal. American military analysts conducted comprehensive studies of tank losses after the war ended. The data, compiled from after-action reports, vehicle damage assessments, and crew debriefings, revealed the impact of face-hardened armor with statistical precision. Sherman tanks manufactured before March 1943 with homogeneous armor suffered total losses, including crew fatalities, in approximately 54% of engagements where they received hits from German anti-tank weapons. Sherman tanks manufactured after March 1943 with face-hardened armor suffered similar total losses in approximately 23% of comparable engagements. The improvement was not marginal. It was transformational. Over the course of the war in Europe, from June 1944 through May 1945, approximately 20,000 Sherman tanks equipped with face-hardened armor participated in combat operations. Precise casualty figures are impossible to determine given the chaos of war, incomplete records, and the difficulty of separating armor-related casualties from other causes. But conservative estimates suggest that face-hardened armor prevented approximately 15,000 crew casualties, including roughly 6,000 deaths, compared to expected casualties if homogeneous armor had continued as standard. Those 15,000 men who survived hits that would have killed them with inferior armor returned to civilian life after the war. They became teachers, businessmen, farmers, engineers, fathers, and grandfathers. Their survival and their subsequent contributions to American society represented the true legacy of Waterhouse's work. The metallurgical innovation that Army bureaucrats had rejected as too expensive and too complex had paid for itself many times over in American lives saved. The post-war period brought recognition that had been impossible during wartime secrecy. In October 1945, the Army Ordnance Department awarded Waterhouse the Exceptional Civilian Service Award, the highest honor available to non-military personnel. The citation, presented by Lieutenant General Levin Campbell, Chief of Ordnance, acknowledged Waterhouse's contribution with language that carefully avoided classified technical details. Dr. Thomas Waterhouse, through innovative metallurgical research and persistent advocacy, developed armor protection technology that significantly enhanced the survivability of American armored vehicles during World War II. His work directly contributed to the successful prosecution of armored operations in multiple theaters and saved thousands of American lives. The Army Ordnance Department recognizes Dr. Waterhouse's exceptional service to the nation. Waterhouse accepted the award at a ceremony in Washington with characteristic modesty. His brief remarks, preserved in Army records, reflected his understanding that technical achievement meant little without institutional support and manufacturing capability to implement it. This recognition belongs properly to the steel workers at Carnegie and Bethlehem, who figured out how to manufacture face-hardened armor at scale, to the quality control inspectors who ensured every plate met specifications, to the tank crews who proved the armor worked in combat, and to the Army officers who eventually overcame institutional resistance to adopt new technology. I contributed an idea. Thousands of others made it real. That's how technical innovation actually works in a democracy at war. Individual insight matters, but collective implementation determines success. The technical legacy of Waterhouse's face-hardened armor extended far beyond World War II. The principle of heterogeneous armor, with varying hardness through the plate's thickness, became standard practice in post-war tank design worldwide. Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks employed face-hardened armor. British Centurion tanks used similar technology. American M48 and M60 tanks featured advanced versions of gradient heat treating that built directly on Waterhouse's wartime innovations. By the late 1950s, when composite armor combining different materials began replacing homogeneous steel, the lessons of heterogeneous armor remained fundamental. Modern composite armor uses ceramic faces backed by steel or composite backing materials, achieving the same principle Waterhouse had demonstrated with purely metallurgical methods. The hard ceramic face shatters, penetrators, while the tough backing absorbs energy and prevents catastrophic failure. The institutional lessons proved equally enduring. The Army's initial rejection of Waterhouse's proposal in 1941 represented understandable caution, given the uncertainties and constraints of that moment. But the 18-month delay before combat necessity, forced reconsideration cost American lives that could have been saved if institutional flexibility had allowed faster adoption of promising innovation. Post-war military organizations studied the face-hardened armor story as a case study in technology adoption. How could armed forces balance the need for proven, reliable equipment against the imperative to adopt innovations that offered significant advantages? The answer involved creating institutional mechanisms that allowed parallel development of promising technologies even when immediate adoption was impractical. The Army established the Advanced Research Projects Agency in 1958, partly to ensure that promising innovations would receive research support even when their immediate application seemed uncertain. The agency's mission included funding high-risk, high-reward research that might not fit within existing procurement programs, but could provide decisive advantages if successfully developed. Waterhouse's face-hardened armor represented exactly the type of innovation ARPA was designed to encourage. The industrial implications were equally significant. American steel manufacturers learned that technical innovation in specialized applications like armor plate could provide competitive advantages that justified research investment. Carnegie Steel and Bethlehem Steel both established expanded metallurgical research programs after the war, seeking to replicate the success of face-hardened armor in other specialty steel markets. The economic impact was substantial. American steel companies became world leaders in specialty metallurgy through Porter's Redden's Corti, the 1950s and 60s, competing successfully against foreign manufacturers by offering superior technical performance rather than merely lower prices. The expertise developed manufacturing face-hardened armor translated directly into commercial applications, ranging from construction steel to pressure vessels for chemical plants. Dr. Thomas Waterhouse continued his metallurgical research after the war, focusing on peaceful applications of the technical principles developed under combat pressure. He joined MIT's faculty in 1948, establishing a research program in materials science that trained a generation of metallurgical engineers. His students went on to careers in aerospace, automotive, and construction industries, spreading the rigorous analytical approach that had characterized his armor development work. Waterhouse died on March 7, 1976, at age 74, from heart failure at his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his wartime contributions in a single sentence, noting he had developed improved armor for American tanks. The classified nature of his work meant that detailed discussion remained restricted for decades after his death. Not until documents were declassified in the 1980s did historians fully appreciate the scope and impact of his innovations. By then, most of the tank crews who had benefited from face-hardened armor protection were elderly or had passed away. Veterans occasionally mentioned in oral history interviews that their Shermans seemed tougher than earlier models, that they had survived hits that should have killed them, that their armor seemed to work better than they had expected. They rarely knew why. The technical details of face-hardening processes and metallurgical innovations meant little to men who simply wanted to survive and come home. But their survival testified to the reality that technical innovation, properly implemented, could determine the outcome of human conflicts as decisively as courage, training, or tactical skill. The Sherman tank's reputation improved substantially when historians began examining its actual combat record, rather than relying on popular myths. The narrative of Sherman inadequacy, while containing elements of truth regarding firepower and armor thickness compared to German heavy tanks, obscured the reality that American armor protection was far more sophisticated than simple thickness measurements suggested. Modern metallurgical analysis of surviving World War II armor plates confirmed Waterhouse's achievement with precision impossible during wartime. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground conducted detailed examination of Sherman armor plates in 1998 using modern testing equipment, including scanning electron microscopes and digital hardness testers. Their report, published in the Journal of Materials Science, documented the hardness gradient through face-hardened plates with extraordinary detail. The surface hardness of properly manufactured face-hardened armor reached approximately 550 Brinell, approaching the hardness of tool steel. Hardness decreased gradually through the plate thickness, reaching approximately 280 Brinell at the backing surface. The transition zone, where hardness changed most rapidly, occupied approximately 20 to 30% of the plate thickness. This gradient structure maximized both impact resistance and toughness exactly as Waterhouse had intended. The 1998 study also included ballistic testing that replicated wartime conditions. Modern reproduction, German 75mm armor-piercing rounds, were fired at original World War II armor plates recovered from scrapped Sherman tanks. The results confirmed wartime data. Face-hardened plates 3 inches thick defeated projectiles that easily penetrated homogeneous plates of the same thickness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.